Before the first coin flip, before the first kickoff, you just gotta check out the Sideline Sizzle with the youngest sports commentator in American radio. Here's Tristan Blackmon with the Sideline Sizzle.
Welcome to another edition of the Sideline Sizzle, brought to you by the City of Conway Parks and Recreation Department. Preseason is coming to a close, which means the NFL regular season is on the way. College football is also coming very soon. Speaking of college, this week marked the start of classes for me. I'm attending Coastal Carolina for the foreseeable future, so wish me luck. Maybe you should be wishing our football team some luck instead. They opened the season against UCLA, which to me seems less than ideal. Anyway, we will kick off our show with a little bit of news. I do intend to cover some fantasy football tips for this upcoming season as well, but we'll cover that in the next segment. Starting off, I'd like to comment on the shocking preseason game we saw this past week between the Washington Commanders and the Baltimore Ravens. Alright, maybe shocking is too strong of a word. In reality, nobody cares. In fact, I didn't even watch the game. I could care less about either Washington or Baltimore's preseason for that matter. I'm so ready for actual football to start that I haven't even been watching the Broncos preseason. I forgot it was on. After seeing how they played against Arizona a week or two ago, I'm ready for the worst this season. Anyway, getting back on track here, the Commanders made a pretty cool comeback and actually defeated the Ravens. Normally this would be just another preseason game, but for Baltimore, it sure wasn't. If you're unaware, which I would expect you to be unless you're a Ravens fan, Baltimore held the longest preseason winning streak in NFL history up until they played Washington. The Ravens had won 24 consecutive preseason games, an NFL record of course, after Washington managed to snag the win following a 49-yard field goal from Joey Sly. They celebrated as if they had won the Super Bowl. No, you didn't. You didn't win the Super Bowl. You didn't even win a regular season game. This was preseason. It doesn't count. Washington fans are just bathing in this preseason victory because, the streak is broken. Who cares other than Ravens fans and now Washington's fans? Literally, nobody cares. At least I don't. It's like, it's preseason. Why is everybody worshiping this feat? Ravens fans as well. They're probably saying the same thing now, that it's just preseason and it doesn't count. Why didn't you keep that same energy when you had the winning streak? Clearly it meant something to Baltimore because they held that stupid preseason record for a while and celebrated it every year. Now that they're no longer undefeated, they don't seem to care. So, in short, this news is a bit of a waste of time, but if you've seen any clips of the game wondering why the NFL is shouting, "The streak is over," you know why. How about we stop celebrating preseason victories and focus on winning the real thing? I get that may have sounded a bit harsh, but seriously, Washington actually celebrated as if they'd won a championship, and they haven't been a winning franchise for years. In fact, their last playoff appearance took place during a season in which they didn't even have a winning record. All I'm saying is that while it was a cool comeback win, it simply doesn't matter. Moving on to an update we got out of San Francisco this week. Last week, I had mentioned that the 49ers had named Brock Purdy the starting quarterback long ago, but still had an interesting scenario with three other somewhat talented backups sitting behind him. Between Sam Darnold, Trey Lance, and Brandon Allen, my main question last week was this: who would be the 49ers backup this coming season? We know that Brock Purdy is the guy, but with three pretty solid options sitting behind Purdy, I, and potentially many 49ers fans, were curious to know who the backup would be. My questions were answered this past week as the 49ers named Sam Darnold the second-string quarterback for this coming season. This may come as a surprise for many who haven't been observing the 49ers training camp, as many were anticipating Trey Lance to at least be the backup, potentially even the starter for 2023. Lance is only entering his third NFL season, and just a few years ago was taken third overall in the NFL draft. Coming out of North Dakota State and heading into the NFL draft, I loved Trey Lance. He had a cannon for an arm, elite mobility, and simply a ton of potential to be the next great hybrid quarterback. Lance unfortunately didn't get a proper chance, having to battle injuries and better quarterback talent ahead of him. This offseason, a lot of people speculated that Trey Lance could have a bounce-back season, despite guys like Sam Darnold, who I doubt is all that much better than Lance, and Purdy battling for a spot alongside him. Allegedly, Lance isn't likely to have his sort of bounce-back season that we anticipated, based purely on his performance in training camp. From what I've heard, Lance can make some pretty crazy splash plays, but is unable to execute on the fundamental plays like simple short passes and checkdowns. He can hit a guy 40 to 50 yards down the field one moment, but then the next moment he'll miss a wide open target standing 15 yards in front of him. Yes, it defies logic, and with the 49ers, there will be plenty of plays where Lance would need to capitalize on a wide-open target or deliver a quick short pass. If Mr. Irrelevant can claim the starting job on this team and have a great deal of success, that should be an indicator on how efficient Kyle Shanahan's system really is. Seems like any quarterback can thrive under Shanahan, any quarterback except for Trey Lance, apparently. I'd really like to see Lance get a second chance, but it is alarming that such a high and somewhat recent draft pick in Trey Lance can get outcompeted by Sam Darnold of all guys. Really? Sam Darnold? I watched Darnold play live in Charlotte when he decimated my Denver Broncos, but that's about the only positive moment I can recall Darnold having within the past few seasons. There could be some teams interested in acquiring Lance in order to give him a second chance. If Jordan Love isn't the answer, maybe Green Bay would be interested in Trey Lance, or maybe the Tennessee Titans if Will Levis can't fully blossom. There's of course teams with big quarterback questions now, such as the Raiders, who coincidentally are home to Jimmy Garoppolo, maybe even the Arizona Cardinals, who are likely going to be without Kyler Murray for a good bit of time. I've also seen the Vikings pop up in some of these discussions. The Atlanta Falcons could be a good fit for Trey Lance, assuming Desmond Ridder doesn't outcompete Lance as well. I think Lance, he's a guy that teams will be willing to give a second chance to. However, I am uncertain the 49ers would be able to end up trading him and receiving value in return for a player like Lance. Moving on to a massive trade, massive in my opinion of course, that was announced just a few days ago. Former 10th overall pick, star linebacker / safety at Clemson, and Arizona Cardinal Isaiah Simmons was recently traded to the New York Giants. Now, a lot of fans unaware of how great Isaiah Simmons was in college need to hold their horses with the Simmons hate. While I go to Coastal Carolina, I can still root for my childhood team in Clemson, and having watched Isaiah Simmons in college, I knew he'd be good in the NFL. While his skill set is definitely difficult to translate to pro football, he's still an elite hybrid player. He's extremely fast for a box safety or even a hybrid linebacker, and I think with Brian Dable, he will fit in much better than he did while in Arizona. Cardinals are so abysmal, and Simmons never got a chance to really utilize his skill set the best way possible in Arizona's defensive system. That may just be my personal bias because I think Simmons is and will be a good player for the Giants going forward. He'll likely play somewhat of a role at linebacker despite his recent transition to safety, since New York has the safety position pretty much locked down now. Unless the Giants keep Simmons as a purely rotational type player, I expect him to play some reps at linebacker. The actual trade details between New York and Arizona are quite interesting to me. When I heard the news that Simmons had been traded, I expected a decent return for the Cardinals. Instead, the Giants only had to trade a 7th-round pick in order to acquire Simmons, which I think is a bit of a steal. Arizona likely intended on cutting Simmons if they couldn't find a trade partner, which is a clear sign that they are set on tanking. The fact they haven't relieved Budda Baker of his duties at safety is honestly sad to me. He's the only guy left on the Cardinals who shows remotely any interest in performing at a high level. If Arizona intends on entering a rebuild, I doubt Baker remains a part of it, which is why I'm confused why he is yet to have been traded or released. For the Giants, though, I really like this move to acquire Isaiah Simmons. I'm confident that he does great things for them moving forward. Alright, now we're going to sort of rebound back to the Washington Commanders. I know we already spoke on their preseason victory that was way overhyped, but in that game, star receiver Terry McLaurin, arguably their only piece on offense, suffered an injury. The injury didn't look very brutal at all from what I saw, and thankfully it isn't. McLaurin is expected to have suffered a turf toe or something to that degree in his foot or ankle, but he should recover fairly quickly. The word is that he should be good to go for week 1, which is very good news considering how he is one of the best players they have on the team in Washington. Moving on to some not so good injury news, especially not so good for the Denver Broncos, sadly. Wide receiver Jerry Jeudy was unfortunately helped off the field after suffering what looks like a hamstring injury. Jeudy was expected to have the most productive season of his career this year and was locked into the Broncos' number 1 wide receiver. Russell Wilson targeted Jeudy a lot during training camp and preseason for that matter, and now he's going to have to look elsewhere as Jeudy is expected to miss some time. They said several weeks. The word is that Jeudy will miss several weeks, likely missing several regular season games from my understanding. While there is some optimism that it's not going to be a long-term injury, it is still a massive loss for the Broncos offense. This comes after receiver KJ Hamler departed from the team due to a heart condition, and wide receiver Tim Patrick tore his Achilles, leaving him another season-ending injury. The Broncos wide receiver room, they can't catch a break, and this is quite tragic for the team that is quickly running out of depth at wide receiver. Denver might need to start thinking about signing someone like, Julio Jones maybe. I know the guy doesn't have much left in the tank when it comes to pass catching, but he's available and could be someone the Broncos turn to. It's nothing to get excited about though, because this injury is terrible. The fact that Denver, their training staff, they still haven't solved the injury bug. The fact that they haven't done that yet is absurd to me. The Broncos, they need to get a grip on this injury dilemma. Something has to change. Sean Payton getting to Denver was supposed to be the first step to solving this injury madness, but it seems like that hasn't really changed anything, has it? It's not like Sean Payton can just bless these players and prevent any injuries from happening at all, though. I just find it unfortunate that the Denver Broncos haven't had a fully healthy wide receiver core entering a season for quite some time. Hopefully Jerry Jeudy isn't affected long term, and he's not expected to be, and luckily the first couple opponents for Denver are manageable without him. This will be one of those moments where Russell Wilson has to step up big, which I'm not sure he can do. Based on the word of how Courtland Sutton has performed in training camp, this could be his moment to shine, taking back the role of the number one wide receiver on the team. Man, the Broncos, they just make me frustrated. You've been listening to the Sideline Sizzle, brought to you by the City of Conway Parks and Recreation Department. Fantasy football season is here already. I did a fantasy draft a week or two ago, and coincidentally, both the receivers I'm starting on my lineup in Terry McLaurin and Jerry Jeudy both suffered injuries in recent succession like we just talked about. I'm not all that worried though. This could never be worse than the time when the first running back I selected was Devonta Freeman from the Falcons, who proceeded to have one of the worst seasons of his career. I actually say it was his worst season. Statistically wise, it wasn't that bad, but he lost his job after that year. I'm also still shocked that I almost used my first pick to snag that guy. What was I thinking? Anyway, we'll cover my top fantasy football targets so that you don't end up making the same mistakes that I did several years ago. You would not want to pick up a bum this season. I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of money riding on your fantasy football leagues. We've got that coming up next right here on the Sideline Sizzle.
We're talking football. You got a problem with that? This is the Sideline Sizzle.
Welcome back to the Sideline Sizzle, brought to you by the City of Conway Parks and Recreation Department. Last segment I mentioned that we would take a look at some fantasy football. To be more specific, I'll give a brief overview on my top picks for this coming season. If somehow you ended up with the number one pick in your fantasy draft, I'll discuss my personal strategy when it comes to making the most of your draft picks in that spot. I'll also go over some sleeper players, a couple guys you may want to consider deeper in your fantasy draft. So let's kick things off with my must-have players for 2023. Well, starting off should be pretty easy. This is probably a universal draft selection anywhere you go, seeking counsel for your fantasy draft, whether it be YouTube, various sports websites, maybe even a book if they still make fantasy football guidebooks. I personally have never picked one up, but anyway, getting back on track, the consensus number one fantasy player should be Justin Jefferson. Some may argue differently, like you should pick up Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, or maybe even a running back like Nick Chubb, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, whatever. Any other answer than Justin Jefferson to me is irrelevant. He is and should be the consensus draft selection in this spot. The other names that I noted are great, don't get me wrong, but Justin Jefferson tops all of them. Jefferson had 184 targets last season. Before getting any deeper into how good his stats are, let me explain something. Fantasy football, the biggest thing to look for when selecting a player is volume. When I say volume, I mean how often is this player the primary option on an offense. Looking at volume also means you should evaluate the talent of the player and the talent around him. You don't want to take a team's number one receiver as early as possible purely because he gets a ton of volume, when at the same time, his quarterback is awful. Mike Evans or Chris Godwin are great examples of this because with Baker Mayfield, I don't know how frequently these two will actually receive the ball, despite how talented they actually are. With Justin Jefferson, though, he's got the talent and the talent around him. There's not so much talent that he needs to fight in order to get targets, which is something I would look out for if you're trying to get a top guy. because it's pretty clear that Kirk Cousins favors throwing the ball to Justin Jefferson, especially when nobody is open. Jefferson is the perfect option. He has a quarterback who is capable of delivering him the ball, but also relies on Jefferson. That's why Jefferson, with his 184 targets last season, totaled over 1,800 yards and 8 receiving touchdowns. Now, I mentioned Ja'Marr Chase's name earlier for good reason. Let's say Jefferson gets taken before you have a chance to select him. Plenty of other great players are on the board. Plenty of great options are available. Ja'Marr Chase being one of them. Last season, Chase missed 5 games, which did impact his fantasy numbers. Even having missed 5 games, though, you may be surprised to learn that Ja'Marr Chase still was targeted 134 times and tallied over 1,000 yards and hauled in 9 touchdown receptions. He did all of this while also battling for targets between T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, and others. Unlike other receivers, Chase does not struggle with the talent around him because even with some very talented receivers alongside him, Chase still puts up very acceptable numbers. Personally, I would not draft him very high because I've been targeting running backs early, which we'll get into later, but he's a great option. I think seeing the production he had last season, even after missing games, is a very good indicator of how he'll perform whether or not Joe Burrow misses the first several weeks of the regular season. If you plan on taking Ja'Marr Chase, make sure you have some solid depth at receiver or other reliable options to put up points in Ja'Marr's place if he actually does have a down year. While the news around his quarterback Joe Burrow has been very positive, I think there is still a slight possibility that he misses a game or two, so when drafting Ja'Marr Chase, just err on the side of caution. I would apply a similar strategy to receiver Cooper Kupp. He was the best receiver in the game just a couple years ago and nearly shattered the 2,000 receiving yard barrier in 2021. He did suffer a season-ending injury last season, and unfortunately, he was on my fantasy team at that time. With Kupp, there is the possibility that he re-aggravates an injury, and there is also the possibility that his quarterback, Matthew Stafford, falls victim to injuries as well. It happened last season and is bound to happen again based on the caliber of the offensive line that Matthew Stafford is forced to tolerate. So if you plan on rocking with Kupp, just know that the Rams are, first of all, a terrible team, and second of all, have endured very bad injury luck as of recent history. For me, it's a little too risky to consider drafting Kupp, but if he stays healthy, I can assure you it's worth the draft pick. Kupp, he opened the season posting up like 30 points a game, so it's definitely a bit of a gamble that, if successful, will be very fruitful for you and your fantasy squad. Now, other options to look out for in terms of receivers this high are guys like Tyreek Hill, who I guarantee won't disappoint you, Stephon Diggs, and Devontae Adams. These are all proven players with quite a few accolades, but there are also options with room to grow, like CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, or maybe even Chris Olave. In terms of receivers, I would keep an eye on, but wouldn't consider drafting in the first round, are receivers like Calvin Ridley, Keenan Allen, DK Metcalf, or maybe even Jalen Waddle. Regardless of who you select among these options, you're probably going to get a good player, but just keep in mind the volume and available targets these players will have, and also talent. Don't take Chris Godwin in the first round because I assure you it's a mistake. Now, all the players that I mentioned were wide receivers, which are great for sure when it comes to fantasy points. However, historically speaking, running backs bring so much more value in fantasy football, which is ironic considering how little value they're worth in real life in the NFL market. Running backs usually get a good bit of volume based on the offense, and not only can they acquire fantasy points through rushing yards, but receiving yards as well. A lot of running backs nowadays can double as wide receivers and get a lot of production through the passing game. Austin Eckler, for instance, is a very popular pick because he's a good rushing back, but also receives a lot of action through the passing game. He's a very interesting player, and because of how productive he could be in both passing and rushing plays, Eckler was often the number 1 selection last year. This year, I wouldn't take him that high, but he definitely deserves consideration as a first-round guy. Also, be on the lookout for Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb, who, for some reason, are slipping down draft boards. Those two players not only receive a ton of volume, but are so talented out of the backfield that they'll put up a lot of points. What I found weird is that in one of the fantasy drafts I just did, both Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb slipped so far down the board that I managed to pick up both of them for my team. In my opinion, that's a deadly combination, and if you have an opportunity to make a move like that, then go for it. Christian McCaffrey might be my favorite running back this year in fantasy because he gets even more action in the passing game than guys like Eckler do. He's also an extremely talented ball carrier, and just like many years past, is the best running back in fantasy football right now. His health used to be a concern, but ever since he hopped over to San Francisco, that has been no concern at all. Even on a very heavy workload, McCaffrey has shown little signs of slowing down. Later in the first round and in the second round, consider guys like Tony Pollard, Saquon Barkley, Aaron Jones, and Joe Mixon. I would say Josh Jacobs, who is likely going to go very high in fantasy drafts, but he's currently been holding out from the team over contract disputes. Similar to Jonathan Taylor, who I would advise to have some caution on. When it comes to players holding out based on contract concerns, just be careful because these situations are delicate, and based on how Le'Veon Bell reacted several years ago, these players may not play at all in 2023 just to get a point across, which is definitely something you want to avoid for your fantasy team. Alright, now I want to cover some players that you should target later in the draft. Some of these guys, they could be depth picks, and some of them are guaranteed starters for sure. In previous drafts, I found myself with very little depth at running back, but this year that was not the case. One of my fantasy teams, the one with both Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry, have great depth. I've got Travis Etienne, James Cook, and Alvin Kamara outside of Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry, so it seems pretty loaded to me. Now, the people who were drafting alongside me probably aren't the sharpest tools in the shed because their draft strategies were awful, and the haul that I got with my running backs should show that pretty well. In your fantasy draft, you probably won't see those kinds of players fall down the board very far. However, if you can, pick up guys like Travis Etienne, who is not a depth pick. He's a starter for sure. Try to get some options like James Cook, Bijan Robinson, Dameon Pierce, Ramondre Stevenson, or Miles Sanders. These are players that you definitely could and probably will have a chance to start. They also have a great deal of success when put in that spot, but you may want to have them purely as depth pieces. Now, in terms of wide receivers, you shouldn't have any issue getting good depth at this position. I can't stress the volume part of drafting this position enough, though, especially for depth players. Get guys who may not be the most talented at a glance, but at least get some decent volume. Michael Pittman is someone that I targeted this year to be a depth piece. Right now, he's the Colts' #1 receiving option, and he's got the volume. He isn't the most productive or the most talented, but he has proven to be their best receiver. It may also be a good idea to target second and third string receivers for ultra-talented teams. For instance, T. Higgins or Tyler Boyd for the Bengals. They're phenomenal players that will probably find their way into your starting lineup if you get a chance to draft them. For 2023, you should not have a problem getting good depth at receiver, and make an effort to target some rookie wide receivers as well. Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith, and Jigba even, they're all guys who could explode onto the scene in 2023. Surprisingly, I found that players like DJ Moore, Gabe Davis, and Brandon Ayuk are undervalued for this upcoming season. Just keep your eyes peeled for solid receivers because unless you're in a 12-man fantasy league, getting top-tier receivers late in the draft is bound to happen to you if you play your cards right. Now, if you are in a 12-man fantasy league, I'll drop a few names that you could pick up, which usually fall way down the board. Personal favorite of mine is Courtland Sutton. He's a solid option for the Broncos. There's also guys out there like DJ Chark, Zay Jones, George Pickens, or Darnell Mooney. And if you're sitting there thinking, oh, those guys won't be available late enough in that draft, I'll go even further down the board. How about Michael Gallup, KJ Osborne, Jonathan Mingo, Romeo Doubs, Treylon Burks, Van Jefferson, or Robert Woods? I guarantee you at least one of those names will make it to the waiver wire round, so don't tell me that that's not good enough for you in your 12-man fantasy league. Personally, I recommend playing in an 8-man fantasy league. It's just much easier, much more enjoyable, but hey, what do I know? And with that, I've covered all my tips for fantasy football where it matters. I know I skipped over quarterbacks and tight ends, and I guess kickers and defense as well, but don't worry about that. If you want me to draft your whole team for you, then that's not going to happen. I'd recommend taking a tight end in the early to mid stages of your draft and a quarterback around that same stage. That's my personal draft strategy, and I ended up with Darren Waller in my draft, so there you go. I also didn't get a very good quarterback. I ended up with Kirk Cousins. I mean, he's solid, he's good, he's going to put up points, but then again, you'll find your way if you're a rookie drafting in fantasy. You'll find your strategy, but follow my tips, and I think you'll have a good time. Anyway, that's all I've got for my fantasy tips, and that's also all I've got for today's show. If you want to check out more of the Sideline Sizzle, head over to our YouTube at youtube.com/@theSidelineSizzle, or check out our website at thesidelinessizzle.com. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you next week as you've been listening to the Sideline Sizzle, brought to you by the City of Conway Parks and Recreation Department.